Banijay Police, Scarlet speaking, how can I help you?
We've got an incident it's just developing here in the cave called Rockfall. Someone in the cave, there's been a rock fall.
It was meant to be a 5 or 6 hour easy trip, and little did I know it was going to turn into a 50, 60 hour epic.
I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to be alive. I feel incredibly lucky to be able to walk. I mean, I'm a stubborn git that just won't die.
We're in an area of the Brecon Beacons National Park, and the particular area we're in is called Penwyllt. It's an old quarryman's working area, so it was quarried through the Victorian period, mostly for the limestone rock and the silica rock that was around it. But underneath that layer of limestone is an extensive cave system. It's called Rockfall, Cave of the Black Spring, and it's been a popular, let's say, recreation ground for cavers for many, many years.
I love OFD, not only because it's convenient being situated right underneath the caving club. It's one of the larger systems in the UK. It really does have everything. I've been caving now for about 5 years, but very intensively. I will have done hundreds of trips. I've completely lost count, to be honest. Caving is a terrifying prospect for a lot of people, I think, because their mind instantly goes to the nasty stuff, and we do that, but we do that as a means to an end to get to the good stuff, the pretty things that you can't see anywhere else on the planet. It's a bit like going to the moon or going to the bottom of the ocean in that respect, you know, that exploration element. The plans for the 6th of November were to do a relatively short, 5 to 6 hours max, caving trip with 2 friends, Melissa Bell and Mark Berkey.
George and Mel and I have caved together quite a few times, and this was going to be a pretty standard, easy trip for us.
It was bonfire weekend, so the caving hut was full. We were going to have a full fireworks display, and then the next day we were going to meet up with a few more people and have another easy trip.
We were entering via the Cwmdor entrance, which is very close to the caving club. Cwmdor isn't what you would call a beginner's entrance to this cave system. It involves some very, very tight body-sized tubes which require you to pull yourself through them and sort of contort your body in order to fit through them.
You're fairly quickly entering around about 20 minutes of crawling before you enter the cave into somewhere called Cwmdor Jama.
And then you emerge into a large chamber called Big Shacks. And from there, the route finding in Cwmdor really begins. There are multiple different routes you can go from there around the cave. The idea was to go to the smithy. So there's 2 main areas of the cave. There's the smithy and the upper smithy. So the upper smithy is less travelled. And then the lower smithy is where most people go. So we went round there to start with, and then at the end of the trip, we ended up in the upper smithy.
With a view to taking photos at this part of the cave, because it's very pretty. So we climbed up through the calcites, took some photos at the crystal pools.
And then explored the upper smithy area, taking a couple more photos as we went. Yeah, it was a good fun trip, you know. As the final passage was drawing to a close, we'd explored the area and this was the last bit. Now, on our way to that end, all three of us had passed over an area of jammed boulders, which formed the floor in order to take us over what's known as a rift.
So you've got two walls of rock either side of you, and they're quite narrow. They're normally, body width.
And at some point in the past, there's been rock collapses from the ceiling, and it's created a false floor level.
So when you come along as a caver, you'll see what looks to be a solid surface, but actually you'll be suspended, potentially 10, 20 metres over what is actually the bottom of the rift.
All three of us walked over it on the way over there, and then on the way back, Mark walked over it first.
And as I was walking forwards, I heard what sounded like an earthquake.
So I was yelling. Mark obviously could hear what happened, but I think he initially thought that something had happened to me because I was the one that was screaming.
George! George!
I'd taken a few steps back and there was a hole in the floor now, around about sort of 5 or 6 foot in diameter, that hadn't been there a few moments before.
I was the other side of this massive hole in the floor, so I couldn't actually get to Mark at this point. And we were both yelling for George.
George! George! Where are you?
He'd fallen quite a distance. It looked about to be, 8, 9 metres, and we couldn't hear anything from him. So, my initial fear was, well, the worst had happened, that, he'd been killed.
There was no response for around about a minute or two, and that is possibly one of the longest minutes or 2 minutes of my life. We thought he was gone. And then I heard a groan.
Both of us were incredibly relieved just to know that he was conscious or semi-conscious in some way, shape or form.
My first objective was I had to get to him. My next objective was to check him over the best I could. It was obvious to me that he had some pretty significant injuries. There was a lot of blood coming from his face and mouth. So I looked at him and I said to him, George, I've got to go. I've got to go and get help.
When I woke up, I was in a very different state to the state that I'd started in. There was a lot of pain coming from my jaw. I had teeth missing and other teeth kind of rattling around in my mouth. There was also a lot of pain coming from my right leg. During those early stages of the accident, honestly, I wasn't sure if I was going to make it or not. And then if I did pass out, the chances of me sort of, choking on my own blood or something similar, or if I vomited maybe something and not made it.
While I was waiting for the rescue team to come back, I was attempting to talk to George.
We've got help on its way.
I needed to make sure that he was still conscious.
And he's getting the rescue for us.
I was asking George about his life, about what he does for work, about his partner who was driving up to Wales that day with their dog to come and see the fireworks display.
There were times when I was, really actively fighting to stay awake and stay with it and wiggle things and do as I was told.
So I was in this tiny little space just trying to think of what would motivate George to hopefully stick around.
I was tired, I was pretty adrenaline-fueled. I could hear cavers coming in towards me, so I shouted out to them, help, help. So as soon as they approached me, I asked them who's the fastest, who's the quickest, get out, get the alarm raised. I was very aware of the time ticking by at that point.
After the first caver came out and raised the alarm, I put the immediate messages out on our warden's WhatsApp to say, possible incident in Ogoffanandee, stand by. And about 10 minutes later, Mark arrived. You could see the panic in his eyes straight away. And almost instantly then, Mark relayed some amazing details. Having that detailed knowledge from Mark saved hours and hours. Dragon 8, this is Dragon Base. We knew we needed to get some underground first aiders into that cave system as quick as possible. We were lucky, there were people around Caving Club here, and we were even more lucky that there was still one person on the surface here that was an advanced first aider from the team, and more importantly, perhaps, was willing to go underground, assuming that responsibility. So we got an immediate team ready to go in less than half an hour of Mark giving us the description of the injuries.
I lay in that rift for about 3 hours with Mel above me, and she talked to me the whole time.
And keep talking with me.
We talked about life and partners and dogs and jobs and, you know, anything and everything really, just to keep me sort of talking and with it.
We're going to be sat in the clubhouse with a pint, and we are.
I was on a slopey boulder down to this hole in the floor that had opened up under George. It wasn't a comfortable place, it wasn't a safe place for me. And I was surrounded by loose boulders that, you know, if I moved, I could potentially knock on top of George. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to do any more damage than had already been done.
I'm not quite sure how she managed to continue to think of things to say non-stop for 3 hours, but especially because she's normally quite a quiet and private person, but somehow she managed to pull that out the bag. I may not have made it through those without her, you know.
I think at this point in time I'd run out of questions to ask him, so I briefly stopped talking as well, and I could hear the voices and the relief that went through me at that point in time.
I remember the arrival of the first team of medics. I heard noises in the distance that sounded like people. And it took me a couple of minutes to sort of confirm to myself that, you know, it wasn't voices in my head again, because this wasn't the first time I'd thought I'd heard people coming. But this time it was actually for real.
George, can you hear me? It's Steph, I'm one of the first aiders from Cave Rescue.
My name's Stephen Davis.
What's happened to you there?
And I was one of the advanced first aiders for the OFD rescue back in November.
Okay, mate, can you tell me where
We spent a lot of time training for dealing with these incidents. It's very common for our advanced first aiders to be deployed far in advance of doctors.
I'm just going to take your pulse here just for a moment.
For someone to be as injured as George was and to still be alive is quite unusual.
I'll pop this onto your finger here, George, just so we get a measure of
So it was definitely an element of deciding to keep calm whilst knowing that there was an inner panic going on.
Can you open your mouth for me a second? See, you've got a bit of bleeding there, haven't you?
So the initial prognosis was obviously the very visible fracture to his jaw and the open fracture to his jaw. Concern about him choking on that blood because of the position that he was in.
Something penetrated all the way from the bottom of my face, all the way up into my mouth. So there was kind of this, what I dubbed the blowhole. And the reason I called it that was because I could pinch my nose and close my lips and still breathe through it.
Pop your hand on there for me. Good man, thank you.
He had a significant deformity to his lower leg as well.
Yeah, that was really, really painful, ridiculously painful.
His chest injuries were certainly a concern as they were making it hard for him to breathe. So we started an oxygen chain and getting more supplies in. One of the things that really stuck out to me was when I asked George if he would like some morphine, his answer was yes.
We need to order some more down.
Okay.
Together with that.
Sort it out then.
That'd be perfect.
In the very first team that went underground to George's location, not only were they taking first aid equipment, they were also taking some communication equipment. And we prefer a system called Cave Link. It gives us the ability to talk through text messages through solid rock. It was quite a number of hours before the first messages started to appear.
Casualty has significant deformity of the lower leg, chest.
Fairly hideous confirmation that the injuries are significant.
The first aid team are requesting the stretcher with the full...
You're deploying stretcher teams, you're needing professional medical help in this case. Rebecca Specht came up first on the list.
When we got the call out from the cave rescue team, my husband and I were both packing up our camper van, ready to come up to the club with our children for the social weekend that was due to be happening. So we grabbed our rescue kit as well and put that into the van. They did tell me that the casualty was George, who I knew.
I do vaguely remember the first doctor arriving. It is very vague. I believe that by that point, I was slowly slipping into, a bit of hypothermia and perhaps a bit of shock. But yeah, it all starts getting a bit sketchy from there.
I could see from the numbers that they had been recording that George was obviously quite unwell, and those numbers had been deteriorating in the time that the advanced first aiders had been with him. He had a deep penetrating wound to his chin, which I could see was extending down to the bone. So that I knew there was a potential that that could affect his airway. I suspected that he had rib fractures and his oxygen levels in his blood were low, so I was concerned about the possibility of a lung or chest injury underlying that. His heart rate was quite high, and so we suspected that there may be some hidden internal bleeding somewhere. He also had a fracture to his leg, so the lower portion of his shin was at a 30-degree angle to the upper portion of his shin.
So even though George was a matter of 100 metres below us, the significant injuries that he had meant that there was little or no chance we would be able to bring him out through the same entrance that he went in.
Now, I've done this trip as a caver more than once, and I know how long it is. It's not massive. It's not a massively long caving trip in itself. It's only a few hours. But when you consider that the rule of thumb for a rescue is if it takes you an hour to cave it, it will take 10 hours to carry it on a stretcher. All of a sudden, it does become a long time.
We knew that we'd need significant resources to help out in this rescue. And we've got a large team, and with a relatively swift hit of a few keys on a laptop, we can message all 130 of our team members to give them an alert. There's a rescue going on in Ogorthfanandy, and we need some help. And in terms of control room staff, you have to think about actually resting yourself. You can't keep going for hours. We were now into the early hours of the evening. You've been at it 6, 7, 8 hours without much of a break. And instantly I was thinking ahead of, right, who's going to replace me when I become effectively worn out, unavailable. So I got on the phone to Gary Evans, another warden within the team.
My emergency alarm went off on my phone while I was actually in some woodland on Gower. And then my phone went off a second time, and I actually stopped and rang in to get more information. And that's when I knew this potentially could be something a bit more serious, and then came out to the rescue straight from work. It's very difficult to try and put the pieces together of what's going on, because you've only got the information that comes out through the communications, and what people bring out to the cave when their shift is over. So for the early part of the rescue, we hadn't had anyone come out with an update, and we only had some communication from underground, and nothing seemed to be happening. He seemed to be in one place, not moving. We knew he needed oxygen. We knew he wasn't very well.
At the point where we were lifting George into the stretcher, we needed 7 of us to lift him. Because the space in which he'd fallen was so restricted, it was a real challenge to get that number of people into that space. And we had rescuers climbing over one another, sitting in each other's laps, and essentially it was like a giant game of Twister, trying to get everybody into the position that they needed to be in order to lift George as safely as we could.
There were around 16 to 18 hours of the rescue that I don't remember. And that period starts around about when Dr. Speck turned up.
I went to talk to his partner and just let her know what sort of condition George was in without really telling her all of the graphic details, because I didn't want to completely freak her out at that point in time. But she wanted to know how he was. She wanted contact with somebody that had been with George. So I spoke to Julie for half an hour afterwards, just to tell her the situation. The Saturday night when I was out of the cave, I didn't really sleep at all. George was still underground, and every time I would drop off to sleep, I would see him falling. That moment where the boulder just went underneath his foot, and I was convinced that he'd be able to step forward and it would be fine. And obviously he didn't.
Around about midnight, I handed over to Gary Evans, leaving it in his really capable hands, meaning I could switch off, I could go and collapse in a bed for a few hours, and I could think about other things. And between Gary and I, we pretty much assumed that control role throughout the entire rescue.
That's when the idea of starting to bring more teams in actually began to happen. One of the key players then was Emma Porter, who's the Secretary of the British Cave Rescue Council, and she had all the contacts necessary to make that happen quite quickly.
I got a phone call to say things were getting serious. Further cave rescuers were needed. I called out teams from all over the country. We were calling out teams from Derbyshire, the Yorkshire Dales, at different times. We had to plan ahead and make sure that we'd got people who could arrive at different times. We've got different skill sets, got people who knew the cave, and then people who we could put in teams that could work together and complement each other.
And you could really hear that people from all over the country, you could hear different accents, and you knew a lot of people were from teams a long way from here. So the route from where George fell to coming out of the top entrance, we can consider that in phases, really. The first phase was getting him from where he fell into the main Cwmdor cave. The second phase was moving him from Cwmdor to the start of the Streamway. Then the long period was the Streamway. It's a long way up the Streamway. You're going upstream, so the water's flowing against you. The next phase was to go up from the Streamway up into the upper levels, and that's where the pitch hole took place. And then the final phase was to go from the top of the pitch and out of the cave through the top entrance. When it comes to the underground team, there are a number of key roles there. And someone has to control all that. And that's our underground controller. So that's the person who will take the responsibility and will make key decisions underground.
My name is Jules Carter, and I've been involved in rescue for quite a few years, and my role is as a warden and as an underground controller. The underground control, if you like, works around George. So it's like a bubble of people around George as we move along. That first stage took many hours, and it took us, 6 to 8 hours just to move him out of that spot. And then we got him just to somewhere just slightly bigger.
At points during the journey so far, my vital signs hadn't been good. I was on oxygen by this point because my oxygen sats weren't very good on air, and my pulse had got quite fast at one point as well.
In my day job, I'm a consultant in anaesthetics and intensive care. Hypothermia is always a risk underground. The ambient temperature in UK caves is about 10 degrees.
Hypothermia is something that always has to be on our minds as cave rescuers.
So shortly after I got to him and would come down another vertical drop, we got back into the main passage, which was quite a lot bigger than the stuff he'd been in before. And we were able there to set up a kind of a warming shelter area. So we basically stuck a load of rope up and hung some foil blankets off it, and it makes a big silver-lined box which warms up remarkably quickly. Keeping people warm is really, really important. If people have had a big injury and they start becoming hypothermic, that rapidly ends with things getting out of control, and people getting hypothermic with significant bleeding is strongly associated with people dying. One of the things we were worried about was that he was potentially bleeding internally. And the problem with internal bleeding is that you can't see it. You can't really do anything about it outside of a hospital, but you can bleed into your tummy or into your pelvis, your entire blood volume, and obviously that would be fatal. So we were suspicious that was happening, but there really was nothing we could do about it. We knew that we needed to get him out. We knew that we needed to keep him as warm as possible so that his blood would clot. You can give a bit of fluid, but giving too much fluid can make it worse. And we did give him some tranexamic acid, which can help slow the bleeding down. But ultimately, if it's something that needs an operation, you need to be somewhere where they can do one of those, and that's a hospital.
On the surface, it really ebbed and flowed. There were times when things were relatively quiet. We were managing the rescue in the control room. We were dealing with incoming communications. We were calling people out. And there were times when it was bedlam. At one point, I remember being outside. There were cars everywhere. There were more than 50 people around me, and we had people inside sleeping, and we had loads of people in the cave. So there was just this sense of something really big happening.
I don't recall a rescue within Britain that's ever been like that before. And, you know, almost 300 volunteers in different capacities. It was just absolutely phenomenal.
It became apparent to me partway through the rescue when I started recognising faces not only from Wales but also from the Mendips and the Peak District and Forest of Dean and Yorkshire, that people were coming from all over the country to come and help rescue me, and a lot of them as well. But I was on so much morphine at that point that I actually didn't recognise them. So they were kind of talking to me, and there was banter going backwards and forth, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but at some point after being really quite cheeky to them, I kind of looked at them and said, "Who are you again?"
We are all volunteers. We are all from different walks of life, different parts of the country. And everybody came together as one team to help rescue George.
Caving is a fairly niche sport. There's thousands of us rather than tens of thousands of us. And yeah, you see each other around. And when you see the rescues happening, you always see some friend or mate that's involved with the rescues. And it is a comforting thing to know that should the worst happen, you've got friends to call on as well as professionals.
So all caves are formed by water, so it's the action of water moving through limestone is what forms caves. And a lot of caves, that water's long gone, and so they're all dry passages. What makes Ogofwnnanddu interesting is that the water is still flowing in the lower section of the cave, and that flowing water is what we call a streamway. So if you like, it's an underground river. And that streamway is at the bottom of some really tall, narrow passages. However, when it comes to cave rescue, that presents us with all sorts of problems because we've got to be able to move a stretcher with a casualty and try to keep them dry.
I remember arriving at the Streamway. I remember them adding the floating parts to the side of the stretcher so that the stretcher wouldn't sink in the Streamway.
And when you hit the Streamway, it's really tough. It's noisy, it's wet, there's moisture in the air, communication's harder because you've got all that Streamway noise.
You're going upstream, so the water's flowing against you. There are deep potholes on the way. And all the time, fighting against this water, trying to keep George dry and continue to make progress.
It took the rescue team a long time to carry me down the Streamway. And I now understand that it wasn't just carrying me down the Streamway. You know, there were points where people were literally lying down in the Streamway so that the stretcher could be passed over their backs to keep me out of the Streamway.
What we have to be careful of is that our rescuers don't become casualties too. With so many people underground, you know, we have a responsibility to make sure those, you know, all of those individuals are looked after.
You're planning on the surface, swapping your teams around, rotating your rescue teams so that they're not underground for huge amounts of time.
And we had a team that were volunteers who came along to do all the catering for us, known as the Soup Dragons, and they were essential to morale and keeping people going.
I think when individuals were coming out, they were tired. You know, our cave rescuers had been on shifts of 10, 12 hours. People found it, you know, really mentally draining. Some people would just go straight to sleep. Some people want to eat and just try and sort of refresh themselves, ready if they've got to go back in again. And some people, you know, were quite emotional as well.
When I first came out the cave after my first shift underground, that was a teary experience, you know. It brought a lot of things to the top for me.
A pitch is essentially caving speak for a sudden change in height. So, you know, anything truly vertical is usually referred to as a pitch.
So in order to move a stretcher straight up, we need to use rope work, and the people that are able to set it up to use those ropes we call riggers.
I was called on the Sunday morning and asked if I'd be able to come down with a very specific role of rigging some pitches to haul a casualty out. At some point as we were heading in, one of the stretcher teams were coming out and they just looked exhausted. They were soaking wet, they were freezing cold. And at that point, I think we started to understand the gravity, the full gravity of the situation, and that potentially that this might not be a pleasant end to this particular rescue.
Riggers have to have a lot of experience and skill. At the top of a pitch, there will be places where the ropes can be actually attached to pulleys and attached to the cave.
So the main pitch was quite significant. It's a 60-foot pitch. The trick was finding good places that you can tie your ropes to on solid ground to make sure that everything was safe, and then also have enough space that you can get a team of people actually physically pulling on the ropes to get the stretcher up.
So anyone that's working in that area is completely reliant on the way the ropes have been set up by the rigging team. The stretcher is reliant on the work of the rigging team, and those people on the ropes to steady the stretcher are reliant on it. So people's lives rely on the riggers getting that right first time. There is no room for error.
So for me, this was quite a strange rescue in that for the 10 or so hours that I was underground, I never saw George, I never saw the stretcher. We finished our rigging around about midnight, I think it was, on the Sunday night, and we exited the cave. We were told that it was pretty unlikely that he'd be there until the following morning.
That pitch was rigged with a number of ropes, and one of those ropes was attached to me via a harness which is integrated in the stretcher. Another one of those ropes was attached to the stretcher itself.
And that sounds relatively straightforward when someone's being carried horizontally. But when you're going vertically, an oxygen cylinder is extremely flammable and highly pressurized, and if you drop it, you're essentially dropping a bomb. Managing that was a really important and challenging part of it. It took about an hour to haul him up. During that time, you could hear from the top of the pitch that George was not particularly happy. You could hear him screaming every so often. It sounds bad, but hearing him screaming from the bottom of the pitch was reassuring in that he was able to make enough noise that I could hear him from that. It may seem callous, but if you can hear someone from 30 metres away, they're clearly breathing relatively well.
The pitch was probably one of the worst parts of the rescue for me because I was fully conscious for it. And it really wasn't a very pleasant experience. About halfway up the pitch, I did start vomiting, which obviously went all down my front, and I hope no one was standing below me because my jaw was too broken for me to be able to shout, "Look out below."
One of my colleagues, Greg, who was with him on the rope, did a lot of work trying to stop him from vomiting into his own face and trying to make sure that his airway was okay as he was coming up, because obviously George was strapped into a stretcher pretty tightly, so he can't move around. And if someone's vomiting in that position, then that can be very, very bad.
And at the same time as that started happening, I started hitting the really tight bits of that vertical journey. I was plastered against the wall a couple of times. I wasn't convinced I was going to fit a couple of times. And I was, essentially manhandled by necessity through gaps that were barely large enough to take me in the stretcher, all the time whilst vomiting and feeling sick. Yeah, it really wasn't very nice.
1, 2, pull. Stop.
When he got to the top of the pitch, he went horizontal again. He felt a lot better, and we dosed him up with some more painkillers and some more anti-sickness medication.
I was given some more pain relief. And it turned out to be quite a good thing, because what I thought was going to be fairly plain sailing for the rest of the trip turned out not to be.
In the control room, once we got the message to say that the stretcher had reached the top of the pitch, I think some people were starting to think, oh gosh, we're getting there now, it won't be long. But I knew that it wouldn't be quick. It's quite a long way from there, and it's not easy cave to move a stretcher in. So I remember saying to everyone, there's still a long way to go, folks. We just need to stick with it. We need to stay focused.
I was tasked with going underground to act as an assistant underground trawler for the last phase of the rescue. Normally we would have one underground controller, but with so many people now involved in the rescue, it actually required more than one to actually manage that whole process. We now knew that there was a very good chance that we were going to get George out to the surface. The morale was definitely increasing. In a sense, we had to be a little bit careful with this because it's quite easy, obviously, once you get excited, you're getting close to the entrance, to get a bit carried away. So one of the tasks actually was just to try and make sure that the team stayed focused on the task at hand.
So when you're doing this trip as a caver, once you've moved up to the higher levels of the cave, you're pretty much on easy street. So I was expecting things to be pretty easy from here on out, and that really turned out to be not the case.
George certainly found that the longest part of the rescue because he thought it would all be over really quickly.
The passages from the top of rescue pitch towards the exit are really very tight, certainly with a stretcher. At one point, I was used almost like a human drill bit because there was only one way of getting the stretcher through a certain passage, and that orientation kind of changed as the passage went on. So I was kind of lifted, moved forward and rotated all at the same time. And during that movement, I actually ended up losing another tooth on the cave wall.
There were certainly some very exhausted people around. When I went into the control room when I first arrived, there were some of the guys in there had perhaps had 2 hours of sleep over the last 2 nights combined. They'd been working through the nights in the control room and then actually going underground and doing shifts in the cave as well. So yeah, there were some pretty knackered people.
We had the paramedics from the heart team come into the cave. So they're part of the ambulance service that are responsible for more difficult situations. They wanted to take a look at George before he left the cave because he would then be handed over into their care. So that slowed down that last little bit of the carry. And I think that was stressing quite a lot of us out, to the fact that we thought actually it should be over now, but it was because people were doing the right things.
We eventually popped out into Salubrious Passage, which basically means that the cave passage got a lot larger and quite a lot easier to negotiate. And it was quite an amazing experience, really, that last part of the journey, because there were just so many people there.
We kind of made a decision that people, if they wanted to stay underground through towards the end of the rescue, then we would let them do so. And that meant that we actually had, towards the end, we had something in the region of 70 people in the stretcher party. You would see this kind of long string of people, a human chain, ahead of the stretcher, and then the stretcher almost kind of gliding along this chain towards the exit. That was quite a sight to see.
These passages were just lined with people, and they were passing the stretcher with me on it from person to person to person, and there really was a sense of we're nearly there and of it being the home straight. That really lifted my mood as well. I almost enjoyed that last part of the trip. From my perspective, it was kind of a sea of faces going past me on both sides, just person after person after person. And some of them I knew, some of them I didn't know. You know, there were sort of smiles and nods of respect, and even little bits of banter and jokes went backwards and forwards. And yeah, it was amazing.
So at the very end of the rescue, we were crammed into the small control room, waiting for that news that George had finally reached the surface and fresh air, if you like. It's quite hard to sort of explain your feelings at that point. You'd been involved in one of the most significant cave rescues in the UK. You were pretty exhausted, but by Christ, the adrenaline kicks in at that point and the euphoria. So to have that amazing news that he's on the surface, he's about to get in an ambulance and he's about to get to hospital pretty swiftly, was amazing.
It's dark times in many ways, isn't it? Both politically, environmentally, and all sorts of things. And in a small way, this is a really fabulous story. And it's all volunteer, it's all at their own time, it's all at their own expense.
I guess a rescue like this tells us that people are capable of incredible things. People can come together and achieve what seems impossible.
The dedication of everybody involved, absolutely every single person that was a part of that is absolutely phenomenal, and yeah, it makes me feel good about humanity.
I think after a challenging couple of years, incidents like this remind you that people are capable of really quite impressive things when they put their mind to it. It properly represented people from across the country within the caving community, and Dunkirk spirit, if you like, of everybody pitching in.
This cave rescue will go down in history. The way people pulled together for such a long period of time, in really difficult conditions, over 54 hours. It really was a special rescue.
It doesn't surprise me that they pulled it off. I know what cavers are like. They're bloody-minded, generally speaking, very strong personalities. They weren't going to let anything other than a good outcome come out of this. But just because it doesn't surprise me, that doesn't mean it's not amazing. What they achieved is absolutely incredible, and I take my hats off to them.